This lecture is called Religion, Rights and the Secular Space. It's going to cover various aspects of both public and private religion, but also deal with some of the most contested issues around religion, especially in Europe today. The term religion has a long and varied history. It's been used by theologians, anthropologists, social scientists in all kinds of ways. But in this lecture, I'm using the word religion in its widest theological and anthropological sense, as a term which gives some sense and meaning to a search for and an expression of an ultimate reality, a search for a worldview expressed in acts and rituals. There are different categories of religion, often quite simplistically divided into monotheistic, Indian, folk, and now increasingly New Age religions. But for the purpose of this lecture, I'm focusing on issues around two major living religions, Islam and Christianity, in the context of modern UK and European life. Both these religions originated in the East, and both are now, albeit to differing extents, religions of the West. Both have their own internal schisms and conflicts. In his recent Festschrift article for Hans Soas, the renowned sociologist of religion, Jose Casanova wrote, "I would like to begin my own discussion of religion in the contemporary world with a recognition of a paradox, namely that scholars of religion are questioning the validity of the category of religion at the very same moment when the discursive reality of religion is more widespread than ever and has for the first time become global." He continues, "I am not claiming that people today everywhere are either more or less religious than they may have been in the past. I'm only claiming that religion as a discursive reality, indeed as an abstract category and as a system of classification of reality, used by modern individuals as well as by modern societies around the world, has become an undisputable global social fact." Casanova expresses a very modern reality about religion. One basic thesis of early social scientists such as Emil Durkheim and Max Weber was that in the modern age, religions would struggle to provide universal worldviews, and that the products of modernity such as industrialization, globalization and individualism would inevitably impact on religious institutions and the vitality of religious practice and conviction. It would be wrong to deny this sociological change in societies. In our increasingly diverse societies, institutional religion has declined as a singular, cohesive force giving meaning and stability to communities. Our conversations are not so much about religion itself, but about the possible reach of religion and how to protect the perceived secular space. And here religious faith often appears as a problem to be resolved through discussions on pluralism or diversity, or a problem exacerbated by superficial and often stereotypical analysis of the unreasonable demands of religious people. There is a public lack of appetite for a more sophisticated insight into the way religious faith influences and shapes the lives of many believers and how this then impacts on society. People are grouped into religions as if religious faith is what essentially defines them at the expense of all else. And public discourse on religion maintains a cautious approach to the power of theological language, which is often used as a tool for opening up communication between faiths and cultures. For many people, the individualization of religion, not as a transcendental experience, but as a value-laden ethics, has become the most important phenomenon of religion today. With the advances in sciences and medicine, with an increased awareness of world poverty and the issues of socio-economic justice related with it, with a shift in gender roles and expectations, the social and political impact of modern life and globalization, the demise of structured and formal expressions of religious allegiance, something remarkably different has taken place in both the private and the public realm. When whole areas of personal, ethical and political life are being rethought against the background of scripture, this must be viewed as a radical shift in religious consciousness. But this religious consciousness has a public and a private face to it. The question is what we mean by public and what we mean by private. In assessing the multiple and complex reflections of religion and religious values today, scholars of religion have to address the issue of secularism and secularization, and how these terms are intertwined with the way we view religion as a public or private phenomenon. In his seminal work, The Secular City, the Harvard professor Harvey Cox provided a distinction between secularism as an ideology and secularization as a liberating worldview, a historical process almost irreversible, in which society and culture are delivered from tutelage to religious control and closed metaphysical worldviews. Furthermore, religion here in the UK has no specific legal definition, but its influence and impact in society is often assessed through legal cases. Secularization, like religion, is difficult to define because today the term is used rather loosely and ambiguously in both academic and lay debates. But it does point to one key fact, which is that at least in most of the West, religion has lost its public hold. Religion still has its connective and collective attraction, binding people together, as Charles Taylor stated. But society is now one in which, according to Taylor, faith, even for the staunchest believer, is just one possibility amongst others. A cultural phenomenon, religion hasn't declined globally, but been transformed as a quest for the religious or the transcendent is understood and given expression in different ways in the West. Today in the West, one could be forgiven for understanding the religious and the secular as a conversation or clash between two homogeneous terms. But this is simply not true. And yet it's happened for various reasons, and partly because of the frequent media attention given to contesting whether religion is a force for good or bad in the modern world. Here, religious faith, especially monotheistic faith, is often seen as something which directs us to an intolerant past, whereas secularism grounds us in individual freedom and orients us towards a hopeful future. The debate has a simple premise, which is that a gradual secularization of most of the Western world has been realized through a conscious and enlightened distance between church and state, especially after the bloody religious wars of early modern Europe, leading eventually to healthy liberal democracies. The roots of this go back to the Reformation, about which the American sociologist Peter Berger wrote, "Protestantism cut the umbilical cord between heaven and earth." In denying the jurisdictional powers of the Church, Luther advocated personal responsibility for individual salvation. The Protestant Reformation was a precursor to the whole process by which sectors of society and culture are removed from the domination of religious institutions and symbols. Berger speaks not only of the relative evacuation of traditional Christian churches, but adds, "When we speak of culture and symbols, we imply that secularization is more than a socio-structural process. It affects a totality of cultural life and may be observed in the decline of religious contents in the arts, philosophy, in literature, and most importantly, in the rise of science as an autonomous, thoroughly secular perspective of the world." But the construction of secularization as a historical and linear detachment from religion in Europe is misleading, because most forms of secularism are not anti-religion, but anti-theocratic. They want to negate the political power of the Church as the one true normative state or repository of values. Secularism emerged rather in the attempt to find peaceful coexistence amongst different confessions. As Marcel Gaucher argues, Christianity proves to have been a religion for departing from religion. In assessing how the Christian faith is adapted to changing circumstances to preserve gospel values, the Indian Catholic priest Madhati Kunal writes, "What we see in the West today is a culture that began with religious determinations, but which has now become free of those, possessing two dimensions, namely that of departing and liberating from the religious bond. The individual is important and everything turns around the individual. This has given a new model of freedom to society, along with a new social order and a dethroning of religion from its former elevated position in society. The rise of democratic rule, the concept of civil society, the consciousness of human rights and individual freedoms have all accelerated the growth of secularism. So our values are increasingly based on individual human rights and collective rights, and religious belief often points to a world beyond the earthly struggle for rights. As such, it struggles to find a meaningful place constitutionally and politically, even if it does so socially. But it's also important to appreciate that secularity has become an integrative feature of religion itself, by which I mean that faith in God is not about negation of this world, but actually participation in this world, the moral imperative to make things better in the here and now. In most Western societies, the political language is that of liberalism, and liberalism speaks a language of rights, where the individual is at the centre of the worldview. Liberalism recognises and celebrates individual choice, and cultures which don't celebrate religious freedoms are cultures and communities where the rights-based language is seen as problematic, not just in the eyes of humanity, but more importantly, in the eyes of God. The rights-based language not only weakens communal cohesion, but also God's desired religious life, which needs community agreement, not individual dissent. The crux of the debate is not about religion versus the secular and their mutual interdependence, but whether religious expression is undergoing the kind of revival which may threaten or destabilise the relatively calm, well-ordered public and pluralist spheres of most Western countries. To this debate must be added Europe's own soul-searching of her cultural and political future. Many in Europe see her past and her future as Christian, while many see her past as Christian, but the future as secular. A benign social space where the Islamic presence in particular, but also other religious voices, are becoming increasingly problematic. And the conflicts of recent years have made this issue more complex. Jumping back a little bit, while I would reject the claim that 9/11 brought religion back, what September the 11th did do was convince many onlookers that religious expression could quite easily be equated with religious fanaticism, which would have its roots in the interpretation of those very scriptures held sacred by millions. In the case of Islam, Muslim fanaticism was an anti-Western expression, more precisely an anti-American force, which even if practiced by a few, would win the day if American military might did not take steps to curb what it perceived as a real and global threat. The October the 15th edition of Newsweek that year captured this concern vividly on its cover. Why they hate us, the roots of Islamic rage, and what we can do about it. The they referred especially to Osama bin Laden and his circle, but warned also of millions of Muslims who admire his anti-American ideology, even if they don't agree with his terrorist methods. The us is the West, with America lying at the heart of this cultural entity. A sharp distinction between the two worlds is not intended, but the article draws attention to a general discourse which pits the Muslim world against the West. The fallout of these tragic and dramatic events also means that religion has become a public commodity in the starkest sense of the word. Everyone can talk about religion because religion is often in the public radar around a news item. When religion makes news, religious language, with the aid of modern technology, travels thousands of miles in seconds, but in doing so loses both context and depth of meaning. Globalization means that what happens in the trendy malls of Dubai, the streets of Egypt, the caves of Yemen, the streets of Syria, can reverberate across the world in minutes. And many observers concede that globalization, geopolitics, mass migration, and issues of identity and loyalty are some of the crucial factors of this debate. But it seems to me in an era when it seems almost impossible to have any sustained and measured thinking about issues to do with religion, and more specifically Islam, without becoming embroiled in debates on terrorism and militancy, or conspiracy theories against the whole Muslim world. Any serious thinking of the interface between religion and secularism in the public and political domain must understand that the two are mutually interdependent. The thinking around civil society in the course of European civilization is to associate with liberal philosophy, which pits religious faith against the rational. In this world, as I said, the individual is at the centre, and for a truly civil society to develop, the authoritarian sacred must not encroach into the public arena. There is almost a presumption that the public space is neutral and free. But some Christian theologians, like Stanley Hauerwas, argue that this public space of contemporary culture is neither neutral nor free, and that it's important that the Christian community must be distinguished by telling a story that is different from the one propagated by the state. Others, in continuing with this line of thought, state that people of religious faith, including Christians, cannot lobby for special treatment, but that we need spaces for alternative human stories, away from secular modernity. The late Mohammed Arkoun, of French-Algerian nationality, argued that it is exactly nostalgia for a unified vision of human history which has seen the re-emergence of religion, and comments on this particular expression of secularism. I quote from him, "We cannot, for example, accept the concept of secularization or laïcité as it's been historically elaborated and used in Western societies. There is a political and social dimension of this concept represented by the struggle for power and the tools of legitimization between the church and the bourgeoisie. The intellectual implications of the issue concern the possibility, political, cultural, of separating education, learning and research from any control by the state as well as by the church. This possibility, he argues, remains problematic." Away from this kind of thinking about religion and public life is a common counterclaim that religion has been responsible for huge conflicts and wars throughout centuries. Even one example in Europe are the wars of the Protestant Reformation, in which Europe was torn apart, burnt and plundered for almost 2 centuries. That religion has led to huge inequities in wealth and land. Its imperialist cultures have been far more divisive than uniting, and that it has led to all kinds of apartheid and injustices. And in recent years, these claims have been modified to some extent within the new atheism debates, in which religion is seen as a failed science, and where, although all major religions are bad, Islam is uniquely dangerous to civilization. Or as Sam Harris says in The End of Faith, Islam has the makings of the cult of death. Their perspectives are made bold by statistics and surveys which show that many religious communities encourage fundamentalist theologies, readings of scripture which are often intolerant or indifferent to other views outside the faith. Thus, a spectre of more wars of religion loom in the distance. Added to this is the often unfortunate, though sometimes correct, accusation made against religious people that people of faith see themselves as the harbingers of morality based on outdated texts. And as Richard Dawkins contests, morality is always derived from the zeitgeist, the spirit of the times, never from scripture. Many of the current concerns about the religious and the secular are centred on the various meanings of public and private. But it is a struggle to define what exactly is meant by public and private. In a recent comment on the aftermath of the WikiLeaks story, the cultural theorist Slavoj Žižek commented, "This is a paradox of the public space. Even if everyone knows an unpleasant fact, saying it in public changes everything. Privately, one can say anything or think anything. In public, everything can become contested." A consistent rhetoric of the past few years is that religion should be kept a private matter, a matter for the individual conscience, where people can choose to believe and practice the norms and rituals of their faith. And private usually means within the home, the opposite of in public. But belief is by its very nature transportable and accompanies the individual. Even so, it is not the individual religious belief which is of concern, but to what extent this can influence the public in the sphere of politics, legislation, or the common good. Thus, very often the issue is not of religion, but actually of values. If any particular religious the values that any particular religious belief brings, which can be allied with increasing emphasis on the rights of the individual. This fear of giving religion a privileged position in public life and decision-making has become one of the most contentious issues in Europe as a whole. An example of this fear is the essay on the April 10th, 2008 issue of The New Statesman, which had on its cover, "Belief is Back, How Religious Fundamentalism Has Risen Again." The title is meant to alarm and contain various interviews with church people as well as a piece by Baroness Warnock. She argued that while recognising the historical importance of the Judeo-Christian heritage of the UK is not a theocracy, it's a democracy, and religious belief is no basis for lawmaking. Using the example of the Human Embryology Bill, which had just been debated and concluded the previous week, she argued, "I have no idea how many practising Roman Catholic MPs there are, but even if they happen to form a majority in the House of Commons and could prevent the passage of the Embryology Bill, I believe they would have no business to do so unless they could find other reasons other than their own religious convictions on which to base their opposition. It is a role of legislators to be consequentialists. They must not ask, what does my religion teach about this measure, but will society benefit from it in this empirical world?" I assume there'll be many who agree with this position. After all, religion should not have any privileged position in society and certainly not be the sole determiner of our public life. But this stance is both presumptive and dismissive because it implies that people of faith are just one category, some monolithic entity, all expressing the same concerns. And secondly, it demands a gap between faith and the individual, that who we are must not affect what we think and say in public, that the moral good of society must depend on other truths, not personal religious convictions. Whether we talk about our politicians or anyone serving the public, this premise is problematic. It's one thing to say that our religious convictions must not adversely affect the greater good of society, but it's quite another to argue that our lawmakers must not exercise any religious conscience or give it any public voice. After all, lawmaking is not done by an abstract system. It's done by real people with real lives who deal with real moral dilemmas. It is, however, precisely through the law and legal cases that issues of religion surface as stories. Recently from the UK, several cases went to the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. 2 British citizens complained about not being able to wear the crucifix at their workplace and the right not to counsel a gay couple. A Christian couple also lost their case recently because they refused a gay couple to share a bed on their bed and breakfast premises. These kind of stories appear as religious voices wanting exemption from equality legislation in public life and raises all kinds of questions about the place of individual conscience in public life. Many Christians would argue that they feel discriminated against in increasingly multicultural and secular societies. This then conflicts with notions of religious freedom and the individual's right to exercise what they believe is their conscience. Whether or not one agrees, I would argue that in Western liberal democracies, there is no religious persecution because we have the innate overlapping freedoms which make up these societies. Yet the public space has become a kind of battleground. The paradox is that you are free to practice or not practice a faith, you are free to change a religion or reject a religion, but you are not free to blur the boundaries of public and private space. You can believe and say whatever you want in private, but the public workplace demands a different kind of allegiance, and the rule of law, which can rule for reasonable accommodation, often makes no exemptions because individual conscience and freedom of religion often clash with the law of the state, which needs to make choices about how to protect everyone. We live increasingly in a world of diaspora religious communities in which all religions are everywhere, often governed by largely secular regimes. Can the state protect religious freedom when there are different ways of defining religion, different ways of practicing the same faith? And can lived religion in all its manifestation really always be protected by the law? Conversely, in my own view, it's erroneous to think that modern liberal politics precludes any commitment to moral norms. As a renowned sociologist, Talal Asad wrote, To the extent that modern politics employs the language of rights, ideological principles are central to it. Civil rights and human rights are not merely neutral legal facts. They are profoundly moralistic values, constantly invoked to guide and criticize modern politics in the domestic setting of the nation-state and beyond it in international relations. The individual citizen is not required by the political community to be virtuous, but the individual citizen is required to be the bearer of rights that define his or her moral capacity. For Assad, it is the very rationality of human rights language which gives it the flavour of being culturally modern, whereas religious cultures are often seen as non-modern. Religious traditions may have undergone the most radical transformation in recent times, but there is still the impression that religion does not use persuasive reason, but rather force to coerce people into a certain mindset. And this is especially true with the impression one gets of Islam. A striking example of recent times is the growing tension around the issue of religious freedom in Muslim-majority countries. And I'd just like to use one example here to show how this concept means different things in different situations. In recent times in Pakistan, a country infamous for its growing religious intolerance in some areas towards minorities, made headlines on accounts of its blasphemy laws over the case of the young Christian girl Rimsha Masih, detained for allegedly burning pages of the Quran. However understood, does a modern state have a right to retain blasphemy laws or any religious laws which by their very definition mean that religious sensibilities can be insulted? Those in support would argue that a state can define whether and how religion must be protected, even if that means mob justice, threats, and the oppression of open debate. Open debates can only be had in open societies, and open societies come at a personal cost and through collective commitment. Pakistan may not represent all Muslim societies, but it does reflect a common tendency in many Islamic societies to limit the religious freedom of its minority citizens. And I would pose a policy question. How do other countries, namely Western countries where liberal freedoms in today's age allow for religious freedom, deal with Pakistan in terms of policy and aid and its inability or unwillingness to deal with this persecution? How can Muslims outside of Pakistan who see this kind of persecution as unjustified in the name of Islam or human rights speak up and have their voices heard without fear of retribution? And do Muslim countries really care about the religious freedom of the majority or the minority, or is it a concern only because of international pressures? My own view is that in countries where people are fighting for other basic rights, such as food, shelter and education, the relative lack of religious freedom is not a personal nor a political priority. It is not seen as a just cause, because religious freedom, however understood, can only flourish when a society has in place other intellectual and social freedoms. The public-private dichotomy has been exacerbated in recent years with the visibility of minority faith bringing into question the very value of diversity. It is this visibility and the right of self-determination which reverberates from the wearing of crucifixes, the headscarf in France, to Turkey's relentless quest for entry into the EU. When it comes to Islam, attitudes to women, penal law, and issues of honour within the framework of an ill-perceived Sharia law are very often the very things which seem to define the Islamic presence in Europe. It is this aspect of religious determinism which many European citizens of all backgrounds find unsettling in their own personal, social, and political identity. While most European countries have developed particular models of state-church relations, rarely do political leaders in Europe take religious organisations or representatives of comprehensive ideological movements today. They are viewed only as interest groups with a moral agenda, where the religious leaders speak as authorities, not leaders of mass movements. And this is where the current conflict with Islam resides, and it's been compounded in recent years with big stories which have received global media coverage. An example was that of the Danish cartoon crisis in 2005, the 12 cartoons of the Prophet published in September 2005 in the Danish newspaper resulted in outbreaks of violence by some Muslims and sparked off this relentless debate: can Islam and the Muslim world really understand and accept and respect the notion of civil, diverse societies, where there are competing moralities, divergent discourses, where in some ways nothing is sacred and everything is up for critique? Perhaps this is the price for freedom of expression, but the violence within certain Muslim communities confirmed the suspicion many have had that Islam might be a complete idiosyncrasy in the West. An ICM poll conducted in February 2006, around the same time that thousands of Muslims staged fresh protests against the cartoons, showed that 40% of British Muslims backed the introduction of Sharia law in Britain. For many, this relative welcoming of Sharia is itself a reflection of a widening gap between Muslims and the wider society. Then in 2006, the then leader of the House of Commons, Jack Straw, created a national furore when he suggested that Muslim women should take off their face veils as it was a sign of separation. While he acknowledged that he did not wish to be prescriptive and that the immediate context of his concern were the Muslim women constituents visiting his surgery, the issue grabbed media headlines for days. The increasing visibility of the hijab and the niqab and all other Muslim clothing has been one of the most potent signs of female identity in recent years. Muslim and non-Muslim voices have argued for and against veiling, right to self-expression, and some commentators have reiterated the ever-popular Huntington's clash of civilizations theory. But why should a piece of clothing attract such social furore, where all the struggles of human rights, religious expression and political identity seem to collapse or converge? I think it's mainly because the veil has changed as an iconic image. It no longer conjures up images of mystery and lure of the East, but has come to represent everything that the West has struggled against. The full veil symbolizes a barrier to open communication, efforts to attain some semblance of gender equality, and comfortable and open relations between men and women. For many, the wearing of the niqab and the hijab may not be unlawful, but form part of an ideology with no place in modern Western life. And yet, curiously, it's this very covering which continues to be contested in a country like Turkey. Issues around the religious freedom of the individual and the rights of society as a whole can be quite easily contested in the current climate. In the UK and in Western Europe, one sees two quite distinct modes emerging. One is that in the age of globalization, when all forms of media are weaving together the world into a new social fabric, militant extremist religious expression is the one force which could tear society and civilizations apart. The second is the visibility of minority communities in the West, who often assert themselves with a more fundamentalist and rights-based language. This has become particularly associated with Islam, in which the most highlighted version appears to many as an Islam which is intolerant in itself, but which demands tolerance from others. For many Europeans, a tolerant public space is itself under threat from a competitive rather than constructive form of religious discourse. But it's not just the visibility of difference, but the implication of this difference which is unsettling. The bombings on London's public transport in July 2005 sparked off the debate that multiculturalism, which is in essence a way of preserving equal citizenship for marginal ethnic groups, had failed. Many felt that British Muslims harboured no loyalty to Britain, and the question now turned to one of values. Do Muslims hold different values which will inevitably clash with the values of liberal democracies and civil societies of the West? A fundamental problem with such questions is that they are still generally premised on viewing minority groups as monolithic in their identity and self-expression. Even though many now distinguish between a normative Islam and Islamism, cultural, linguistic and ethnic differences are often overlooked, and the individual represents the collective. Other religions face similar issues, but the Muslim collective is often singled out as more isolationist than other communities and unwilling to buy into the trajectory of liberalism, which demands a level of separation between the spiritual and the temporal. Thus, much of today's debate on religion and secularism in Europe is fundamentally about how to integrate Muslim communities into European societies. While thousands of Muslims may live full integrated lives in Europe, the religion is often presented and lived as a definite system of beliefs and non-beliefs which cannot be submitted to any critical inquiry. The discussions around the failure of multiculturalism in the public sphere have also led to renewed interest in the question of citizenship. On a personal note, I strongly believe that there is a vast difference between being a citizen and being a good citizen, and that actually the state itself may have very little to do with the option I choose. Despite its primacy as a fundamental political structure in society and its vast reach, the state remains limited in scope and operation in regard to the social dynamics I choose. So if I feel myself to be a British citizen, then why do I feel this? We should acknowledge that citizenship is not simply tied to having the protection of the right passport or being able to vote and not breaking the law. But I think to feel a true citizen of a country, a fundamental requirement is a sense of belonging. I need to feel that I belong to a place. I need to feel that by belonging, I want to contribute. Without this sense of belonging, notwithstanding cultural and religious differences, I remain a passive citizen rather than an actively engaged person with the moral impulse to take part in society. And this is particularly so in democracies which can flourish and indeed are strengthened only when individual participation is encouraged. Today, most Muslims across Europe, and of their own choice or parental choice, still have links with another homeland. I don't think this should be seen as a test of loyalty or allegiance. It is just the way things are in a globalized age where communication, travel and diversity are all applauded. But if they don't feel that Europe is home or the UK is home, it begs a much deeper question about the compatibility of very different cultures and their ability to live in any meaningful way, side by side. Tolerance of difference does not make the difference more palatable. Britain is not multicultural if that implies equal living cultures. There are dominant white cultures and a variety of subcultures, namely Asian and Afro-Caribbean. And while no culture remains frozen, the subcultures are prone to becoming more entrenched under a delusion that this is a right way to self-preservation. But culture is more than holding on to food, dress and ritual. It is essentially about a mindset, the ability to have vision for your life wherever you live, to be aware of your heritage but not be burdened or held back by a tradition. In this context, citizenship cannot be about a silent, passive presence, even if it's law-abiding. It must always remain visionary and proactive for the good of all. It is this kind of citizenship which Habermas says demands a more costly commitment and motivation, and these cannot simply be imposed by the law. He defines a liberal society as one where citizens should be willing to get involved on behalf of other citizens to promote common interests, and concludes, this is why political virtues, even if they are only levied in small coins, so to speak, are essential if a democracy is to exist. In the UK, cultural and religious diversity poses a challenge, but still allows us at times to compare and contrast value systems and different lifestyles so that we can dialogue towards building more universal values and beliefs. But in the end, we will all have to make choices about what we tolerate and what we keep out. And this is fundamentally a debate about ethics, because even diversity has its limits. For all of us, this means, in the end, having the conviction that whether or not we have a religious faith, we are committed to some sense of the common good, to a shared humanism where human dignity may not always be the same as human rights. And this will become increasingly pertinent in our debates on old age and terminal illnesses, assisted dying, and human agency in bringing about death. But there are so many negative assumptions about the place of religion in society that meaningful debates about religion and pluralism are almost non-existent in the public sphere. The widely accepted and extolled narrative is that healthy democracies must be secular to flourish, and that liberal nation-states do not need religion anymore to give them any sense of direction or moral purpose. Of course, millions of people of religious faith are also secular in their political views, But however one understands secularism and its relationship to democracy, I think it's foolish by any stretch of the imagination to think that religion does not matter and that people of faith simply need to tame their passions. Most damaging is that religious faith is rigid because scripture is immutable. Muslims have a huge stake in this conversation, as Islam is the one faith which in recent years has been perceived, and often quite legitimately, as a threat to the relative social and pluralist landscape of Europe. The potent images of an illiberal Sharia imposing fanaticism, equated with effigy-burning Muslims, has made many Europeans suspicious, indeed contemptuous of Islam. If Islam has nothing to offer Europe, where do Muslims see themselves and their values in the UK and in wider Europe, where their faith seems at best incomprehensible and at worst an evil ideology? Most Muslims would deny that they recognize themselves in such an image, but the debate is real and often played out very crudely in the public domain. There is much at stake here because Europe belongs to us all, and its future depends on us all. But let me conclude with the final example of how religious faith continues to be contested ideologically and legally in the public. In 2011, a case of a crucifix display in Lautsi versus Italy came to prominence. Commenting on this case, John Whitty from Emory Law School makes some pertinent remarks about the visibility of religious symbolism in the public space. The case centred on an atheistic mother of 2 children who challenged Italy's policy of displaying crucifixes in public school classrooms. She argued that her religious freedom and right to a secular education was being violated by the display of this crucifix at the back of the classroom. While the European Court held for Miss Lautsi in 2009, the Grand Chamber reversed and held in favour of Italy. While the court held that public schools should be neutral, it declared that passive display of a crucifix in a public school classroom was no violation of religious freedom, particularly where students of all faiths were welcome and free to wear religious symbols. Italy's policy of displaying only the crucifix was no violation of religious neutrality, but an acceptable reflection of its majoritarian Catholic culture. John Whitty writes that religious freedom does not require the secularization of society, and defends this by saying, religious symbols have often redeeming cultural value. American courts have long recognized that a decalogue is not only a religious commandment, but also a common moral code, that a cross is not only a religious symbol, but also a poignant memorial to military sacrifice. When passively and properly displayed, the meaning of a symbol can be left in the eye of the beholder, a sort of free market hermeneutic. Whitty talks of the importance of religious symbolism cases, which he defines as serious business, stressing that it is about more than a couple of pieces of wood nailed together. And he concludes, and I conclude, those who view these issues as expensive hobby horses underestimate the extraordinary luxury we now enjoy in the West to be able to fight our cultural contests over religious symbols in our courts and academies rather than our streets and battlefields. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Professor Siddiqui. You've raised some very powerful issues. You've discussed some very potent concepts, and I'm sure we've got lots of issues to discuss with you. I think the form now is that we're going to invite people to raise issues with you. There are microphones, and if I point to you, please wait until a microphone comes to you. Please clearly ask your question, because it's going to be recorded for the YouTube presentation. And then I'm sure Professor Siddiqui will do her best to answer. So.
Hi there, my name is Gary McClellan from the Edinburgh Secular Society. Thanks very much for your presentation. I just wanted to ask, you said earlier that many people connect the idea of religion with moral authority, and I would agree with you that that's maybe not an accurate representation. However, in the UK, religious figures are still repeatedly cited as spokespeople and moral authority. In Scotland, for example, in each one of our 32 local education authorities, they are required by law to appoint religious representatives. Of 96 possible appointments, 94 are Christian. How can we change the position of religion in the UK so that it's not seen as the default moral authority?
I don't actually think it is seen as a default moral authority. I think some of the established practices we have, such as having bishops in the House of Lords, or the examples you've given, are legitimately should be debated whether there is still a place for that and what does that bring to the public sphere. And we haven't had that discussion yet. So a lot of these positions are there because of traditional practice, as opposed to seeing them as a moral voice in a largely secular context. I mean, everyone has a moral voice. And I think this is a problem when we have certain kinds of debates. It's very often polarized. Oh, this is what ordinary people think, and this is what the religious voice is, as if the religious voice can't be ordinary. It's that polarization that I think, in the way it's played out in the media, and it is really quite superficial and simplistic. And what we need is not that religion has a privileged voice, but that people of faith don't feel that they are being now discriminated against simply because they have a religious faith. But it's not easy, because the law drags people screaming and shouting to say, as we've seen in some of the examples, that nothing will compromise equal rights for everyone, whatever your religious conscience says.
Some of us, when we see the threat of a rising fundamentalist world power, don't think of the Muslim world, but think of the United States. I mean, the way you painted the West as being increasingly secular, is this really true of the United States, or is there something else going on there?
Well, I was talking largely about Europe and the UK, but I think America is a unique situation where you have a separation of church and state, but at the same time, American society is far more religious in practice than I think European society is. But also, historically speaking, I would argue that it's much easier for people in America to hear the president say, "God bless America," than for us to hear David Cameron say, "God bless the UK." I wouldn't have a problem with that, but I think a lot of people would, simply because historically we're not used to seeing that. That's not just to do with religion, that's to do with the character of the two nations as well. I didn't talk about the rise of evangelical neoconservatism in the USA. I think it just got too broad. But I think if we are going to parallel the rise of Islamic fundamentalism with anything, then it will have to be the rise of certain kinds of evangelical ideologies in the USA. But also from another perspective, which is that many of these ideologies, many of these strands of Christian thoughts have huge influence on politics, whereas we don't really see that here. As far as I can see, we don't really have, irrespective of certain people being in privileged positions by virtue of them being religious, we don't really see in UK politics a huge influence by any religious community or the right of any religious community to lobby our politicians.
In the UK, in Scotland in particular, it's probably considered bad form to make adverse comments about our neighbours. I was trying to glean information from your complex arguments about views that you might express about other nations. As far as I understand, there are very few states in the world that prefix the name of their state with the religious designation. I think the Buddhist state of Bhutan exists, and we now have strong evidence that probably shortly Israel will refer to itself as the Jewish state of Israel. Should we, outside of a country, express views about the name it uses? Is there any firm ground that we can stand on to tell them that that is perhaps a difficult position? Because as everyone will know, in the state of Israel there are Christians, and obviously there are Israeli passport holders who are Arab Muslims. So my question is, should we talk about our neighbors? And if we do, how do we go about it?
Well, the nation state is a dominant way of looking at the global political structure. I don't think the UK can legitimately say to Israel, you cannot call yourself a Jewish state. Globally, we can have a conversation about what that means, but I think every state has sovereignty over what it wants to call itself. Whether that's true or not, and whether it reflects society as a whole, that would be up to the sovereign power. I mean, I can't see how the UK or that the Israeli state would listen to the UK if it said, don't call yourself a Jewish state. What would it gain by doing that? And why would anyone want to listen to what the UK has to say? I think the debate is more about what do we do to create, what do we do to create less tension, the possibility of less conflict, especially in areas where conflict already exists. But I can't see that many states who use religion as a really powerful tool to mobilize society for good and bad, and usually for bad, to be honest, will hear or listen to anyone dictate to them, you shouldn't call yourself this.
There is the notion that theologian, there is a well-known saying that within every one of us there is a God-shaped hole. Now, some religionists view the secular world as whether it's the politics is this God-shaped hole, or whether it's technology, Google or Twitter or whatever. It is absolutely obvious that the human needs to be in a place somewhere. You mentioned that earlier on in your lecture. And now, when a human being feels that they're not in a place where they can feel safe, fear then comes in. What happens when we suffer fear? Now, I could look at two nations where fear seems to apparently give rise to social cohesiveness and cooperation, North Korea being one of them. When we see images coming out of North Korea, we are very impressed with just how much gymnastic ability these people come out with, young kids, to an extent China as well. And we look at the fear within the Western world of beneficial things being withdrawn, cost-cutting, money. It's the fear, it's the God of the Western world. We've seen it with the banking crisis. In your lecture tonight, is there a measure, is there a fear index amongst secularists and religionists that can be used as a predictor of how, as Israel says, you know, they've got the blueprint now for the third temple. They accept in Jewish code that all nations will fight against us. Israel is a bit quiet at the moment with Syria. I don't know what the media or anything. In comparison to Syria and Lebanon, Israel's quiet. But I just wonder if they just humbly accept fear. They know that everyone is going to be pointing bombs at them. Do we accept this fear or not? What do we do?
I don't think I've quite understood the question, I'm afraid. First of all, what I was trying to say, and this is a personal opinion as well as based on research, is that I don't think the secular world and the religion world are opposites. We live in secular societies as people of faith, and a lot of people of faith are secular in their approach, and they want to keep their faith private. They don't want it reflected in public debates or in the politics. Concerns that we all have as human beings are similar. We all have the same fears, the passions, the same desires. But I'm not sure what you mean by an index of fear. When you talk about the banking crisis, despite all the upheaval we've had in the public debate about the banking issue and how we should hold bankers accountable, I suspect that we haven't actually learned much. And that once the crisis is over, once we are back economically strong again, that very few people will have learned a lesson. I'm not saying that religious moral views are an answer to that. I think everyone has to be engaged in what did we lose by the banking crisis, but what have we learned? And learning is not for the religious people only. Learning is for everyone. Unless we are all committed to some shared interdependency, I don't think the crisis will have changed anyone's views. You actually have to morally commit that I am willing to be part of this free environment, this free market economy, this society where human rights and human freedoms people have fought for that and now I'm bearing the fruit of that, living with the consequences of that. That I have to share this public space, but I have to share the public responsibility. And I don't think that all of us are signed up for that. We may think that we are, and we may hope that we are, and we may say that we are. But actually, when it comes down to it, I would imagine that very few of us have learned anything really about the banking crisis.
Can I take privilege from the chair to ask you something, Professor Siddiqui? A couple of expressions that you made really attracted my attention. One was the concept of the veil as a barrier to communication. And you said that there is no place for that in modern Western life. I certainly agree with that. But then I would ask, then, from the opposite perspective, is there a place for modern Western life in the global future? Is Islam more sustainable than other forms of expression of rights or religion?
I was reading, recently, I was rereading bits of Francis Fukuyama's The End of History, where basically he argues, for those, I'm sure some of you know, but some of you may not, that the end of history means that liberal democracies are the best form of government. That the fact that the Western world has developed these fantastic liberal democracies means that it's like it is the end of history. We can't improve on the way we govern. That this is the pinnacle of how a political state should look like. And he argues in that the reason why it was so easy to colonize the Muslim world was, notwithstanding centuries of their own great culture and expansion and conquest, that they had very little intellectual structure holding it together by the time the colonial powers went to the Middle East, to the subcontinent. There may be some truth in that, in the sense that how would an empire now colonize Europe? How would another country now think of colonizing Europe or the UK? Not that we talk about colonialism anymore, but just say the hypothesis that some country in a distant country wanted to colonize it. How would it do that? And I think, to some extent, the issue is not Islam and the Western world, but Islam in the Western world. That Muslims are part of the Western world. Whether they struggle with it, whether they don't understand it, they have been part of the Western world for decades, some for centuries. And that's why the conflict in Bosnia was so poignant, because suddenly Europe realized that it had an Islamic presence in its very borders. It may not have been an Arab presence, it may not have been a subcontinent presence, but it was still an Islamic presence. I don't see the conversations of today and tomorrow being about Islam and the West. I think it's more about Islam in the West. And at this moment in time, despite the rise of China and despite the rise of India as an economic power, I still think that everywhere you go west. The way Western culture has been able to sell itself globally is actually unbelievable if you think about it in such a short space of time. What Western cultures, America and Europe, have produced and sold intellectually, culturally, whether you like it or not, it's been able to sell it. So for the time being, I can't see that There is a struggle here. And maybe Western culture has been able to sell it because what it's selling is premised on freedom of the individual. And that is far too powerful to resist.
A few weeks ago on the news, you could see lots of crazed young men protesting about a film that nobody had ever seen. And around the same time, you could see in a different part of the world a lot of crazed young men protesting about some islands that nobody had ever heard of. Some were Muslims in Australia and other parts of the world. The second group were Chinese. Do you think it's true that some of the suspicion that secularists feel about religion is its ability to harness people's irrationality and people's willingness to feel hatred and violence? I mean, I was astonished to see so many Chinese people who could never have heard of these islands rioting in the streets and so full of passion for their country. And as an onlooker in the West, I didn't see any difference. It didn't look any different to me to see people rioting about this film about Muhammad or rioting about the islands in north of Japan. What I saw was young people who were being used by those able to manipulate them for essentially political means. And I wonder if it's not really about religion in itself. It's about the fear of groups of people being recruited for political ends that we don't understand.
I think you've answered the question yourself. I agree that it's precisely that. But I would say that sometimes when things don't go your way and you want to mobilize people for a certain act, especially if it's a violent act, I don't think anything riles people up as much as religious language. It has a potency, even if you're not a firm believer, it has a potency to, even if you think about, let's use the example of Israel and Palestine, which started off as a nationalist debate. And it wasn't on people's radar for years until both sides started using the rhetoric of religion. Then it became a far more powerful discussion and became a far more influential global news story in the sense that people were not just fighting for land now, they were fighting for something that historically, religiously, and using religious language to justify on both sides what they thought belonged to them. And then the consequence of that is that you can then mobilize global aid, you can mobilize global support, because religious language has, whether we like it or not, the power to mobilize. So I can completely understand why people are fearful of it. Because on the one hand, especially in kind of seemingly moderate, peaceful democracies like our own, it is only when there is an issue of religious intolerance that we see an instability in society, usually. Nothing else really destabilizes society. And so it's especially for those minority faiths, such as Muslims, usually Muslims, for whatever reason, whether it's an actual issue of faith or whether it's some political issue, using religious language is a very easy way to mobilize action and violence.
You mentioned in your discussion about the states, which you said you didn't really want to talk about, how they were a entirely different society. It's very interesting that, in fact, the federal court there has told judges they can't have religious symbols in court, which I think, and have very firmly stepped on some of the excesses of fundamentalism in terms of intelligent design and creationism. But just to say that it's easy for Obama to say, God bless America, and you wouldn't hear Cameron saying something like that. I just wonder if we're going to get through 2014 without this business of the worst ever apocalyptic process designed to sustain imperialism, capitalism, and expansionism in Europe, and the fights that it led to, whether we're going to get through that year without hearing our Prime Minister talk about the Christian values that were being employed to take us all to war.
Well, we have heard about Christian values as a basis for war, and I think those who criticise that in the Iraq War, etc., were right to criticise it. I don't think people of religious faith actually want faith to be used like that. I mean, you can have, this is what I mean by militancy and perhaps extremism, that it's not just about an excess of faith. It's how you choose your faith to commit to more peaceful solutions, not how you choose aspects of your faith to say, because my faith is this, I can commit to this violent act. If anything, the very least we can demand from people to uphold a liberal democracy is that violence should never be a resort to anything. I don't think that's always possible, but at least that's the principle by which liberal democracies flourish, that we don't resort to violence, that there are other ways of making your point. But I'd be very cautious. I mean, I think the media would be very critical here if our own politicians started using religious faith to mobilize people or to try and get their own point across. I don't know whether they should not be allowed to use it, but politics is such a messy business that one would always be suspicious of why people are invoking religion, and especially if it's about going to war. It's already been used, and we've had the consequences of that.
Thank you. I suppose this question really leads on from most of the other questions in a sense, but it's perhaps going to be less eloquent and less constructed. I come at this sort of from the perspective of studying the far right and studying nationalism more specifically. And it was interesting to hear a lot of what you said whilst thinking of these tropes, you know, nationalist tropes. I wondered if you could maybe say a little bit about the parallels between religion and nationalism in these debates, in terms of perhaps creating a space. Secular may not be the correct term in this context, but creating a space which is free from the sort of jingoistic nationalisms, which we have seen throughout history, but particularly in the current context.
So, sorry, the question is, what space are we creating?
Well, it's more about the sort of asking about the parallels between nationalism and religion in these debates, in terms of the way in which you know, a lot of Islamophobic debate, for example, is framed around issues of nationalism and national culture rather than around issues of religion.
You know, I really don't think that I think most people in Britain are very easygoing, very tolerant when it comes to just accepting how multiculturalism, whether it's a failed exercise, whether it's a successful exercise, has shaped Britain. Not everybody will agree that it's given huge value, but many will say that we cannot go back to a time before we had minority cultures or minority religions. We can't envisage what that country could have looked like. I don't think that the far-right debate actually has much mileage at the moment. I mean, it may be attractive to those who are thinking, where is this diversity taking us? What does it mean? I mean, to be honest, some of the kind of debates about religious voices who feel that they are being silenced is also on the back of, it's precisely because we're multicultural that politicians can listen to Muslims, Hindus and Sikhs, but they don't listen to Christians. I think that is a fallacy, and that should not be the way we talk about religion. I mean, it's almost like every religion is listened to, according to some people, but not Christians. You either take as said, for the time being at least, whether it's contested in future, that we are largely still in a Christian, nominally Christian, secular context. Our calendar is marked by the Christian calendar, our holidays, everything. And that religious minorities have their own place, but their cultures don't dominate the largely secular culture of, I would say largely secular culture, Christian secular culture of the UK. And most people, I think, accept that. I think the far right, what it tries to do is to say that there is an idyll that we can go back to, that there is a UK or an England especially. And I think much of the debate about the far right is actually not about a collective view of the UK, it's more about a view of England. So that, you know, Scotland has its own internal debates about what it means, and we will see that increasingly now, what it means to be Scottish. But the far right debate, I just don't think it can hold much mileage. It has an emotional appeal to some, but most European societies now have minority communities in them. So if you are going to make this, I mean, I know that there is a growing anti-Semitism and a growing anti-Islamic, I wouldn't call it Islamophobia, in parts of France, in parts of Germany, but I would also argue that it is the host society, it is the white Germans, the white French, if I can put it crudely like that are still determined to uphold individual rights and respect, and that they are committed to some kind of pluralism. So I think that is still the dominant view. My only concern is that it is the minority communities in these countries that have to also make the move to be more part of the wider host culture. Otherwise, they will suffer the consequences. And that's where the far right capitalizes, when it sees that the minority communities are not making the effort, whether it's right or wrong. But perception is sometimes stronger than reality.
Time's rushing away. There are two up there. Please, with the microphone, yeah.
Thanks very much indeed. I wonder if I could ask you to elaborate a little bit more upon the situation where manifestations of religious freedom conflict with other people's rights. So I'm thinking of, I suppose, most specifically the B&B cases, where individuals' rights to dignity and to respect were in, I suppose, direct conflict with other people's right to religious freedom. And I think these cases are a little bit more problematic than the, I suppose, the symbolism cases, where you have maybe freedom of religion conflicting with the right to be free from religion. And I suppose one phrase I think that you used in your lecture was the freedom of religion clashing with the law of the state. And to me that seemed very, I suppose, mechanical and somewhat impersonal, because really what we're talking about, unfortunately, I suppose, is a conflict of freedom of religion with someone else's right to dignity and right to equality. And I suppose using the terminology or using the discourse of rights seems very much like a, I suppose, modern or modern liberalist approach. But in fact, it could be seen as a natural rights discourse as well, something that comes from religious discourse. And I suppose what I'm trying to get at in this comment is that maybe sometimes there are just direct conflicts of rights. And if we're talking about freedom of religion and dignity, to my mind it's pretty self-evident which needs to be respected, given that freedom of religion can be manifested or practiced in private without conflicting with other people's rights.
I think it is a conflict of rights, but I think the state has to make a commitment, and I think in that case it did, that irrespective of the couple's own conscience and what their religion dictated to them, everyone has to be protected under the law. Now, you could argue, should they have said at the very beginning, because they claim that within their Christian conscience, they wouldn't even allow a heterosexual couple who were not married to share the same room. So it wasn't that they were homophobic, it was sex within marriage, which is what they were concerned about. But then when it came to the gay couple, not only were they not married, but that they also disagreed with their sexual orientation. But I think it is a conflict of rights. The state, however, I would still bow with the state, because I think if you allow a little bit of room for discrimination, then where does that end? Another case might come along where somebody says, I mean, the common example often used for this is, but would it be the same if a black couple had been refused? Now, one of my concerns is that certain things are unfashionable to say anymore. Nobody calls themselves racist anymore. But we use rhetorical strategies to come up with different ways of precluding people to be part of things. Nobody can openly say, I'm racist, and think that they're going to get approval, whatever other people might think. But in this sense, I would say that they can't say in public. That's really what it came down to. They couldn't bar the couple in public because it was a public business, even though it was their own home, but they'd opened it to the public, that I will not allow a homosexual couple to come and stay because the law has already changed our mindset. It may not have changed our mindset, but it's changed the landscape in which we discuss these things. So whether you agree with the law or not, I personally think that the law has to drag us, or is dragging us, into a different kind of landscape. And a lot of people may feel uncomfortable with that. But if I had to make a choice about trying to get rid of all kinds of discrimination and still allowing people to exercise a certain conscience, I think I'd have to go with the former. But it is difficult. But just to say one thing about human rights and human dignity, and I just pointed that towards the end of the lecture. I mean, when it comes to debates that we will increasingly have about assisted dying, and I mean, there is a conflict of what does human dignity look like? And so largely from religious perspectives across the board, human dignity is that we are made in the image of God, etc., etc. So therefore, we cannot cross that milestone where you can assist somebody to die. But the human rights discourse says it is my right to be able to end my life. This is not a dignified living. So the whole concept of human dignity, I think, at least in medical ethics, has changed dramatically.
One more question.
Thank you. I wonder if I might for a moment, just come back to the question that was raised over there about this film, which was made in the United States, was caused such a furore. I was mystified by the fact that that there was such rage directed when it was just one person or a small group of people who made this film. And I asked a friend of mine, who is a very thoughtful Libyan academic, what this was really about. And I said, can't they see that, of course, these people are not the American state, the American government, a small group of people, hopefully a small group of people, even if they do strike a chord with a large number of people in the States. And he said, but it's not so much a question of that. And when the West looks at Muslim states, it very often finds it difficult to distinguish between certain people in those states and the governments. We tend to take a blanket approach to these things. And so we have to understand what's going on there. What he suggested was that film simply added insult to the injury of repeated interventions by the West in the Middle East. I mean, there are certain Libyans who would say, of course, that the West shouldn't have done what it did in Libya. I pass no judgment on that. But nevertheless, he came up with this idea. It was adding insult to injury. And I wonder what you might have to say on that.
I don't know, to be honest, when it comes to things like violence over this kind of film. I think we can draw up grand theories as to why people do certain things, and actually could just be a group of violent. If I can just cast your mind back to something that happened, how many years is it now? 25 years, the Salman Rushdie affair. That came onto our screens because we saw images of a book burning on the streets of Bradford. And on rereading aspects of the controversy around at the time. And it just goes to show how sometimes we can be so misinformed by images, and we tend to, whether you agree that they have a right to protest or not, or whether it's just mindless violence, it's up to you. But in that Rushdie affair, it was one of the first few times that we saw images of what you call Muslim rage. And I remember reading, a journalist had written that he was passing by that street where a few Muslim elderly men had gathered round a kind of a metal container, and they had put the book in there, or copies of the book. And it was slightly damp, and they were trying to light it so it would set on fire. And they kept trying to light the match, but it just wouldn't light, or the book wouldn't light up into flames. And the journalist knew that this would make a great news story. And he said, I went round the corner and I said, here, I've got a lighter. And he had his camera and everything, and they lit it with the lighter, and it just blew up in flames, and he took that photo. Now, I suppose most people don't know that story, but what you saw was just a group of Muslim men chanting death to Rushdie or whatever. And then we formed all kinds of narratives around that. That's not to say that what happened to Salman Rushdie should have happened or not happened. That was a bigger story. But I'm just trying to understand that how certain images sometimes encapsulate not the truth of what's happening, but something different. And mindless violence in the name of religion is probably the best way to get attention about your point, whether it's religious or political.
Okay, I'm afraid I'm going to have to draw things to a close now. It's been an absolutely fabulous session. As I said before, you really did raise some amazingly important issues, and if I may say, had some really good questions. Citizenship must always stay proactive and visionary for the good of all. I think that encapsulates the message that I took. So thank you very much indeed. I'm sure if anyone wants to continue the discussion with Professor Siddiqui, her office at New College is always open.
No, not always.
Otherwise, for now, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
This production is brought to you by the University of Edinburgh.